Transactional Analysis, Injunctions and Decisions, Part 2. In the last issue, we started a section about injunctions and decisions in transactional analysis. We saw that many people carry around childhood injunctions inherited from their parents. These oftentimes are crucial in how the real child writes his or her own life script. We covered the injunctions don't be or exist, don't be you, don't be a child, and don't grow up. In this issue, we'll briefly cover the next 4 injunctions. It bears repeating that these injunctions don't come from the adult or nurturing parent ego states. This is because the parent, and child ego states were formed by a lack of positive strokes on the part of their parents, and so the cycle of positive stroke deprivation persists. The next injunction prevalent in the world is don't make it. This can be thought of as the jealousy injunction. The parent's child ego state is still playing out childhood tapes where he or she didn't get the amount of strokes necessary to develop a free or creative child ego state within themselves. A grown-up carrying this injunction from an adaptive child perspective will never reach his or her true potential when this one is playing in the background. The adaptive child in him will not want to outshine the master, so to speak, in order to receive strokes from his or her parent's critical parent ego state. The key is to be free to be your best. That means to have a high self-image or high self-concept so you can do your best. Any hindrance to this is caused by the critical parent's injunctions or adaptive child interpretations about reality. As we said in a previous video, the map is not the territory, but a distortion made by a young child trying to do his or her best to make sense of the world. The problem is that far too many people take this childhood map and are navigating with this in the real world and wonder why they don't ever arrive where they truly want to go. As an aside, this makes me think of some religious groups who espouse the false notion that it's somehow displeasing to God for you to make a lot of money, to be successful, or even to be happy. As if God is somehow glorified when you have to beg Him each week to pay your bills. I hardly doubt that God sits up in heaven and needs to patch his ego up by watching people suffer. And I think God gets a bad rap for all the critical parent and adaptive child ego state tapes people are needlessly running in the background. Time to tune into another station. It's called the adult ego state. The ego state that takes responsibility and charts a course of action to solve a problem. The ego state that throws away the kindergarten maps. The next injunction is don't do anything, or just don't. This injunction is made by the child ego state in the parent, and we don't need to get any more complex than that. We could say that this is an injunction by the nurturing parent of the parent, but in the end it's not too nurturing when an eternal child is the end product. And actually it's more of the adaptive child of the in the parent speaking with a nurturing parent voice. Not really a true nurturing parent. It is surprising the degree to which many so-called adults need the validation of their parents' parent ego state or the parent ego state inherited from their parents to function, to make decisions. It's almost as if they still function as children needing approval. They fear that mom or dad will withdraw positive strokes if they don't toe some line, and in many cases this is true. The metaphorical umbilical cord is still attached whether they live across town or across the country. In reality, obeying this injunction is feeding the adaptive child within the parent, and this sort of pleasing will never stop as long as the parent remains an adaptive child. From a transactional analysis perspective, the person recognizing that he or she is living under this injunction must bring his or her own nurturing parent to bandage his or her parent's adaptive child. In this way, the parent's adaptive child gets the positive strokes it needs to cope with the event that his or her real child breaks with the normal protocol of not doing something that he's supposed to do. In other words, normally the parent is validated by his or her child obeying this injunction of not doing something. So the parent must get some other validation when the real child breaks this injunction. And if the child doesn't do something like this child is the eternal adaptive child and the bondage continues. The next injunction is don't be important. How many countless millions are living under this injunction isn't very hard to tell. These types of people are happy to take a subservient role and be happy with where they are in life. And who told us that we should only play second fiddle? You hear things like, children are to be seen and not heard. Don't speak unless you're spoken to. I'm the boss around here and what I say goes. Great. I'm so glad I was born into bondage. Now, of course, I'm not advocating that children rebel against their parents. And by stating that the injunctions coming from a parent's critical parent ego state doesn't mean that a parent was trying to be critical necessarily. Often a parent thinks that his or her critical parent is the nurturing parent. The problem is that the child writes his or her life script based upon his or her own interpretation of the injunction. That's why children of the same parents may develop along different paths. Later on, we'll talk about verbal upfront contracts, which come from the adult ego state and how they put both parties on an equal standing, fostering mutual trust. To many parents in this example, this might seem inconceivable because they view themselves as the authority figure, and rightly so. The problem is how the authority is used. Authority can be a hammer or a mutually agreed upon contract where both parties retain their dignity. More on that later. And please understand that the parent-child relationship in these videos is metaphorical for human relationships as a whole. The ego states and life script are developed in childhood but are ultimately expressed in society for a lifetime. The next injunction is don't belong. You're not like the other kids. My son, he's a quiet one. Why can't you be like Johnny down the street? He's in the smart kids class. People carrying this injunction oftentimes feel alone in groups. Now, of course, this is not always because of parental injunctions. A child could just as easily learn this from the other children at school. This can come from the parent's own adaptive child who didn't belong, him or herself, or the parent's adaptive child that tells the child that through the critical parent that it shouldn't rise above its station in life, just like he or she wasn't allowed to. And this reminds me of a story I just read a few months ago in Neville Goddard's book, The Wealth Mindset. In the book, a man came up to him after his prosperity lectures and told Neville that the lecture could not be applied to him because he was born a black man in a white country. The man was totally convinced that he could never prosper because of the color of his skin. Neville replied that this limitation was only in his mind, that if he would truly love who he is and change his beliefs, that he could be whoever he wanted to be. The following is a quote from the book which summarizes what Neville taught him. There's no power outside of the mind of man to do anything to man, and he, by the arrangement of his own mind, by consenting to these restrictions in his cradle and being conditioned slowly through his youth, walking into manhood, believing himself set upon, would have to be set upon. The man either couldn't or wouldn't grasp immediately what Neville had taught him, but met up with Neville 3 years later. This is what he said. Neville, it took me almost 3 years to really overcome that fixed idea that I, by the accident of birth, would be a secondary citizen. But I overcame it. Now here's my office on Wilshire Boulevard. I picked this one not because it was the only one offered, 4 equally wonderful spots were offered to me. I took this one because it had greater telephone facilities, but the others were equally good. Now you couldn't judge my income from this office, lovely as it is. Everything is nice about it, but Neville, this year I'll net $250,000. And this was over 60 years ago that this story took place. The point is that as long as a person keeps listening to the critical parent ego state of the parent or of one's own self, the longer one simply won't be able to belong to higher positions in life that are truly attainable. So in the next issue, we will cover the remaining injunctions.